There's a sound that a tractor makes when it's stuck, not spinning tires stuck. That's just noise and frustration. The real stuck is quieter. The real stuck is the sound of a diesel engine pulling at full throttle against a bale wagon that hasn't moved in 6 seconds. The rear tires churning 2-foot trenches into ground that used to be a hayfield and is now a lake of gray clay that swallows rubber and steel and ambition equally. The real stuck is the sound that means the farmer is not feeding hay today, not because there's no hay. The hay is right there, on the wagon, 12 round bales of it, 14,400 pounds of forage that was supposed to be in the bale rings by 7 a.m. The hay isn't the problem. The mud is the problem. And when the mud is the problem, the hay doesn't matter, because the hay can't get from the wagon to the cattle if the wagon can't get from the barn to the pasture. In northern Missouri, the rolling clay hills between the Missouri River and the Iowa line, the country they call Mudville, in the winters when the freeze-thaw cycle turns every field and lane and feeding area into a bog that a tracked vehicle would struggle with. The mud is the annual tax that cattle operations pay for the privilege of feeding hay in winter. The tax isn't measured in dollars, though the dollars are substantial. The tax is measured in days, days when the ground is too soft to carry a tractor and wagon, days when the feeding lanes are impassable, the days when the farmer has to choose between tearing up his pastures to deliver hay or letting the cattle wait and hope the ground freezes overnight hard enough to carry the load in the morning. The feeding system is the problem. The system goes like this: cut hay in June and July, bale it, store it, in a barn if you have one, in the field if you don't. Starting in November, when the grass goes dormant, load the hay on a wagon or a bale bed, drive it to the feeding area, unroll it or set it in a bale ring, and let the cattle eat. Repeat daily or every other day from November through March, approximately 150 days of hay feeding per winter. Each feeding requires a tractor, a wagon or bale bed, a feeding area, and ground firm enough to carry the equipment. The first 3 are under the farmer's control. I'm the 4th. The ground is under God's control. And in a Missouri winter, God's opinion of firm ground is unreliable. In Macon County, Missouri, the county that sits precisely in the center of northern Missouri's clay belt, where the soil is Putnam silt loam over a clay pan subsoil that's essentially waterproof. The ground goes soft in November and doesn't get hard again until April. The clay pan, a dense, impermeable layer of clay, 8 to 14 inches below the surface, prevents water from draining downward. Every drop of rain and every inch of snowmelt that falls on the surface between November and March sits on top of the clay pan, like water on a plate. The soil above the clay pan saturates. The surface becomes mud. The mud gets deeper as the winter gets wetter. By February, and the feeding lanes on most cattle operations are 12 to 18 inches deep in clay soup, rutted, churned, destroyed by the daily passage of tractors and wagons carrying hay to cattle that are standing in the same mud that the tractor is stuck in. The mud damages everything. It damages the pasture. The tire tracks and hoof prints in saturated soil kill the grass, compact the root zone, and create bare areas that won't recover until June. It damages the cattle. Cows standing in 12 inches of cold mud lose body heat through their legs and feet, burn extra calories to maintain body temperature, and develop foot rot and hoof abscesses from the constant moisture. It damages the equipment. Tractors running in heavy mud consume 40 to 60% more fuel, wear clutches and differentials at accelerated rates, thus and occasionally get stuck badly enough to require a second tractor for extraction. And it damages the farmer's disposition, because nothing in agriculture is more demoralizing than fighting mud for 5 months every year to deliver feed to cattle that are standing belly deep in the same mud you're fighting. Every farmer in Macon County fought the mud. Every farmer except one. His name was Dwayne Heckman. He ran 85 head of Angus cattle on 520 acres north of Macon. The county seat, a town of 5,500 that sits on the Norfolk Southern Rail line and exists because the railroad needed a water stop and the cattlemen needed a shipping point. Dwayne's farm was typical Macon County ground, rolling, clay-heavy, good grass when it was managed, impassable when it was wet. What wasn't typical was Dwayne's winter feeding system, or rather, his lack of one. Dwayne didn't feed hay in winter, not until January, sometimes not until February. His cattle grazed through November, December, and often into January on standing forage. Tall fescue and orchard grass that Dwayne had allowed to grow ungrazed from mid-August through fall, accumulating 10 to 14 inches of standing forage that cured in place when the frost hit and remained available to the cattle as dry standing hay throughout the early winter. The practice had a name in the grazing management literature: stockpiling, stockpiled fescue. The simplest and most underused grazing strategy in the humid eastern half of the United States. The principle was straightforward. Take the cattle off the fescue pastures in mid-August. Let the fescue grow for 90 days without grazing. August, September, October. So apply 50 pounds of nitrogen in early August to push fall growth. By November 1st, the fescue had accumulated 2,500 to 3,500 pounds of dry matter per acre. 10 to 14 inches of standing forage that was 12 to 15% protein and 55 to 65% digestible. Not as nutritious as June grass, but better than average hay and far better than the weathered round bales that most of Dwayne's neighbors were feeding. The stockpiled fescue stood through the winter, the stems stiff, the leaves dry but intact, the forage available to cattle that walked to it and ate it where it stood, the way cattle have eaten grass since there were cattle. No tractor, no wagon, no bale rings, no feeding lanes, no mud. The cattle grazed the stockpiled fescue using strip grazing, a temporary electric fence that Dwayne moved every 2 to 3 days, by allocating a strip of pasture approximately 200 feet wide across the width of the field. The cattle ate the strip, grazing the standing fescue down to 4 inches, consuming the accumulated forage the way they consumed green grass in summer, walking to their feed instead of standing at a bale ring, waiting for the tractor to deliver it. When the strip was grazed, Dwayne moved the fence forward 200 feet, opening a new strip. The back fence moved with the front fence, preventing the cattle from returning to the grazed area, giving the eaten strip time to begin its recovery even in winter dormancy. The system extended the grazing season by 60 to 90 days. In a normal year, the Dwayne's cattle grazed stockpiled fescue from November 1st through mid-January. 75 days of grazing on standing forage that cost approximately $18 per acre to produce. The cost of 50 pounds of nitrogen applied in August. His 85 head grazed approximately 120 acres of stockpiled fescue over the winter grazing period. The cattle eating their way across the fields in 200-foot strips, the temporary fence moving ahead, the feeding requiring nothing more than 20 minutes of Dwayne's time every 2 to 3 days to move the wire. The cost savings were enormous. Dwayne's hay feeding season was 60 to 75 days, mid-January through March, instead of the typical 150 days. His hay requirement was approximately 100 round bales instead of 250. His hay cost at $50 per bale, his cost to produce. $5,000 instead of $12,500. His stockpiling cost, $18 per acre times 120 acres, equals $2,160 in nitrogen. Total winter feed cost, $7,160. His neighbor's total winter feed cost, $12,500 to $18,000, depending on operation size and hay prices. Dwayne was saving $5,340 to $10,840 per year on winter feed. The co-op didn't see the savings. The co-op saw the grass. Dwayne Heckman is letting his pastures go to seed, the feed store manager in Macon reported every September, when Dwayne's fescue grew past the height that every other farmer maintained by grazing or mowing. He's got grass 14 inches tall in October, while everybody else's pastures are clipped to 4 inches. The neighbors are starting to talk. It looks untidy. It looks like he's not managing his ground. The appearance argument was the most persistent one. Did farming communities have strong opinions about the appearance of land? Mowed pastures, clipped fence rows, and short grass signal that the farmer is present, active, managing his property. Tall grass signals the opposite, absence, neglect, the suspicion that the farmer has given up or doesn't care. Dwayne's stockpiled fescue, growing tall and brown through October and November, looked like neglect to every neighbor who drove past on the county road. The fact that the tall grass was a deliberate management strategy, grass that was growing for a purpose, accumulating forage for winter grazing, was invisible to the people who measured management by the height of the grass. He's too lazy to mow and too cheap to graze. His cattle are in the barn lot, eating hay, while the pastures grow to weeds. By November, and those fields will be solid fescue, gone to seed, and nobody will want to drive past his place. The criticism was wrong in every particular. Dwayne wasn't lazy. He was applying 50 pounds of nitrogen per acre and managing a strip grazing system that required more planning and more daily management than dumping a round bale in a ring and walking away. He wasn't cheap. He was spending $2,160 on nitrogen that nobody else spent because nobody else stockpiled. His cattle weren't in the barn lot. They were on the stockpiled pastures from November through January, grazing standing forage, while everyone else's cattle stood in mud at bale rings. And the fescue wasn't going to seed. It was accumulating vegetative growth that would be grazed, not reproductive growth that would produce seed heads. The tall grass was feed. The neighbors saw weeds. Now let me tell you about what happened on Dwayne's farm while his neighbors were stuck in the mud. Because the contrast between stockpiled grazing and hay feeding wasn't just about cost. It was about what happened to the ground. Dwayne's cattle walked across his pastures in winter on ground that was covered by 10 to 14 inches of standing forage. The standing fescue even after the cattle grazed it to 4 inches, left a mat of residue on the soil surface that protected the ground from the hooves above. The residue distributed the pressure. A 1,200-pound cow standing on a 4-inch mat of fescue residue applies approximately 14 pounds per square inch to the soil surface. The same cow standing on bare mud in a feeding lane applies approximately 28 pounds per square inch. Double the pressure, because there's no residue to distribute the load. But the difference between 14 and 28 pounds per square inch is the difference between a hoof print that's 1 inch deep and a hoof print that's 4 inches deep. One damages the pasture, the other doesn't. Dwayne's pastures emerged from winter with minimal damage. The grazed strips recovered quickly in spring because the root systems were intact. The 4-inch stubble height that the cattle left protected the growing points of the fescue, and the spring regrowth started from a plant that was alive and rooted, not from bare ground that had been churned to mud by months of tractor traffic. His neighbors' feeding areas emerged from winter as cratered moonscapes, bare ground, compacted soil, dead grass. Not areas that wouldn't produce forage until June or July because the roots had been killed by traffic and the soil had been compacted by tires and hooves until the infiltration rate was essentially zero. The sacrifice area, the feeding zone where the bale ring sat and the tractor drove and the cattle congregated, consumed approximately 5 to 10 acres on most operations. 5 to 10 acres of pasture destroyed every winter, requiring reseeding, fertilization, and an entire growing season to recover. At $200 per acre for renovation, seed, fertilizer, tillage, the annual sacrifice area cost was $1,000 to $2,000. Added to the extra hay cost and the equipment wear from mud work, the total mud tax on a typical 85-cow operation in Macon County was approximately $4,000 to $6,000 per year in costs that Dwayne didn't pay, because Dwayne's cattle walked across their feed instead of standing in mud, waiting for it. This is the story of Dwayne Heckman and the standing grass. It starts with a January afternoon in 2019, when every tractor in Macon County was stuck, except the one that wasn't running, because it didn't need to be. The winter of 2018 to 2019, northern Missouri. The same wet winter that ruined Round Bales in Harrison County, 100 miles to the west, created a mud catastrophe in Macon County that made the normal mud season look like firm ground. November through March, Macon County received 24.8 inches of precipitation, 55% above the 30-year average. The claypan soils, already poorly drained in a normal year, went to full saturation by mid-November and stayed saturated for 4 continuous months. The ground never froze long enough to seal the surface. The temperatures oscillated in the 25 to 45 degree range that produces freeze-thaw cycling, which pumps water into the soil profile and prevents the hard freeze that creates a temporarily firm surface for equipment traffic. The feeding lanes disintegrated. Operations that normally experienced 12 to 18 inches of mud in the feeding areas were dealing with 24 to 30 inches. Mud deep enough to bury a tractor's axle. Deep enough to trap a cow that lay down and couldn't get up. Deep enough that some farmers abandoned their primary feeding areas entirely and started unrolling hay in their crop fields because the crop fields with their better drainage from years of tillage, and were the only ground on the farm that would carry a tractor in January. The stuck tractors multiplied. Every farmer in the county had a story. Ray Pemberton's 7810 buried to the frame in the feeding lane on January 14th. Took his neighbor's 4WD articulated tractor and a chain to extract it. The extraction itself tearing 200-foot ruts across the pasture. Gail Trumbo's bale wagon broke through the frozen crust of a field crossing on January 22nd and sank to the axle with 12 bales on the wagon. The bales had to be removed by hand in the mud before the tractor could be pulled out. 3 hours of work in 30-degree rain to deliver feed that should have taken 20 minutes. McKinney Scobie's farmall lost a drive shaft in the mud on February 3rd. The differential housing cracked from the torque of trying to pull through clay that had the consistency of wet concrete. The cattle suffered. Animals standing in 24 inches of mud burn 20 to 30% more calories, maintaining body temperature because the mud conducts heat away from the lower body 25 times faster than air. An 85-head herd in deep mud consumed approximately 15 to 20% more hay than the same herd on firm ground, not because the cattle were hungrier, but because the feed was being burned to replace the heat the mud was stealing. The extra hay consumption accelerated the hay shortage that the wet winter was already creating by making every feeding trip more difficult and every bale delivery more uncertain. Near Dwayne Heckman's cattle were on stockpiled fescue. His strip grazing system was operating as designed. The cattle walking to their feed across pastures where the standing forage protected the soil surface from the hooves above, and the root mass held the soil structure intact below. The mud was there. The clay pan doesn't discriminate. And Dwayne's fields had the same Putnam silt loam over the same impermeable clay layer as every other farm in the county. But the mud was beneath the forage mat, not on top of it. The cattle walked on grass, not on bare ground. The hoof prints were 1 to 2 inches deep instead of 6 to 12. The pastures were wet but passable. The cattle were eating but not churning. The feed was there, and the cattle walked to it, and the tractor stayed in the barn. By January 15th, near Dwayne's stockpiled fescue was grazed through. 75 days of winter grazing, the standing forage consumed strip by strip, the 120 acres providing 85 head with adequate nutrition from November 1st through mid-January without a single bale of hay being fed. On January 16th, Dwayne started feeding hay. 100 round bales stored in his hay shed, delivered to a feeding pad that he'd built in 2004 specifically for the hay feeding months. The pad was a compacted gravel area, 100 by 200 feet, with 8 inches of crushed limestone on a geotextile fabric, designed to carry tractor traffic in wet conditions without rutting. The pad had cost $6,500 to build and $500 per year to maintain. The pad was firm when every feeding lane in the county was soup, because the neighbors noticed Dwayne's system the way neighbors notice anything that differs from the standard, slowly at first, then all at once when the standard breaks. The standard broke in January 2019. The standard was stuck in the mud, burning extra fuel, tearing up pastures, feeding extra hay to cattle that were burning extra calories to survive the mud that the feeding system had created. Dwayne's cattle were walking on grass and eating from a pad. The first neighbor to ask was Ray Pemberton, the man whose 7810 had been buried to the frame on January 14th. Ray drove to Dwayne's farm on January 20th, 6 days after the extraction that had torn 200-foot ruts across his best pasture. "Dwayne, I'm stuck every other day. I've torn up 3 acres of pasture just driving to the bale rings. I've burned $800 in extra diesel this month pulling through mud that I can't avoid because the cattle have to eat and the hay is in the barn and the feeding area is a swamp. Your cattle are in the pasture. They're walking on grass. They're not standing in mud. How? They grazed the stockpiled fescue through mid-January. Now they're on the feeding pad. I haven't driven a tractor through a wet pasture since 2004. Stockpiled fescue. I stopped grazing in August. I put on 50 pounds of nitrogen. The fescue grows 10 to 14 inches by November. The cattle eat it through the winter. Strip grazed, electric fence. 200-foot allocations every 3 days. No tractor, no wagon, no mud. The cattle walk to the feed. The feed is standing in the ground. Yet the ground doesn't get torn up because the forage mat protects the surface. And the hay. I feed hay from January through March on a gravel pad. 100 bales instead of 250. My hay season is 60 days, not 150. My mud damage is 0 because the tractor never leaves the pad and the cattle never stand in a feeding lane. Ray was quiet. He was running the numbers. 150 days of hay at $50 per bale times 250 bales, $12,500, plus $800 to $1,200 per year in extra diesel for mud work, plus $2,000 per year in sacrifice area renovation, plus the uncounted cost of equipment wear, veterinary bills from foot rot, and reduced cattle condition from standing in cold mud. Total mud tax, approximately $16,000 per year. Dwayne's total winter feed cost, $7,160. The nitrogen, the hay, and the pad maintenance. The difference was $8,840 per year. He had over 30 years of the stockpiling system, $200,000 to $65,200 in savings. $265,000, Ray said. That's what mud costs over a career. It's the cost that nobody calculates because the mud is just winter. The mud is just Missouri. The mud is just what happens when you feed hay to cattle on clay ground from November through March. But it's not what has to happen. The grass can carry the cattle if the grass is there. The grass isn't there because you grazed it in September and October when it should have been growing. You ate the insurance, and now you don't have it. My pastures don't look right in the fall. The grass is short. Your pastures look right to the neighbors. My pastures look right to the cattle. The cattle don't care about appearances. The cattle care about whether there's something to eat in December and whether the ground they're standing on is grass or mud. Now let me tell you about the extension meeting. Because what happened in Macon County in March of 2019 changed the winter feeding conversation in a way that 30 years of grazing management publications hadn't. The University of Missouri Extension Office in Macon organized a winter grazing field day at Dwayne's farm on March 15, 2019, 2 weeks before spring green up at the end of the worst mud season in county history. The extension agent, a woman named Karen Decker, had been promoting stockpiled fescue grazing for 12 years, since she'd seen the research from the University of Missouri Forage Systems Research Center in Linnaeus, 30 miles south. It's where scientists had demonstrated that stockpiled tall fescue could provide adequate nutrition for beef cattle from November through January at a cost 40 to 60% below hay feeding. Karen had been promoting the system for 12 years. Nobody had listened. The feed store thought stockpiling was lazy. The co-op thought it was neglect. The neighbors thought the tall grass was unsightly. The cattle industry in Macon County was committed to hay feeding the way the grain industry in Illinois was committed to continuous corn. Not because it was the best system, but because it was the only system anyone knew. The mud of 2019 changed that. Karen invited every cattle producer in the county. 150 invitations sent through the extension mailing list. 63 showed up, the largest turnout for a grazing meeting in the county's history. And they stood in Dwayne's pasture, the pasture that had been strip grazed from November through mid-January, the stockpiled fescue consumed by 85 head over 75 days. The pasture looked grazed, but intact. The grass was short, 4 inches of fescue stubble, but the ground was firm underfoot. No ruts, no bare spots, no compaction, no sacrifice area. The hoof prints from 3 months of winter grazing were barely visible because the forage mat had distributed the pressure and the roots had held the soil in place. Karen asked the farmers to look at the pasture and then to think about their own feeding areas, the bale ring zones, the feeding lanes, the sacrifice areas that were currently 24 inches of mud with dead grass and tractor ruts, and the particular devastation that 5 months of daily equipment traffic creates on claypan soils. This pasture fed 85 head for 75 days, Karen said. No tractor entered this field. No hay was delivered to this field. The cattle walked to their feed, and the feed was standing in the ground. The pasture sustained minimal damage because the forage mat protected the surface. Mr. Heckman's hay feeding season was 60 days, mid-January through mid-March, on a gravel pad. His total pasture damage from winter feeding, effectively 0. His mud damage, 0. His sacrifice area, 0. She paused. How many of you lost more than 3 acres of pasture to mud damage this winter? Every hand went up. How many lost more than 5 acres? 40 hands stayed up. How many had a tractor stuck at least 3 times this winter? Most of the hands stayed up. Some farmers laughed. The bleak laughter of recognition. 3 times was a good winter, and some had been stuck 10 or 12 times. Dwayne spoke. He wasn't comfortable speaking to groups. He was a quiet man, 68 years old, the kind of farmer who communicated more with his hands than his voice. But Karen had asked him to say something, and what he said was the thing the county remembered. The system everybody uses, bale hay, store hay, deliver hay, assumes the ground is firm enough to carry a tractor from November to March. On our ground, in our climate, that assumption is wrong half the time. Every other winter, the ground goes to soup and the system breaks. You can't deliver hay to cattle through mud that swallows your tractor. You can deliver cattle to standing grass that they walk to on their own feet. The cattle don't get stuck. The cattle weigh 1,200 pounds on 4 hooves. Hey, the tractor weighs 12,000 pounds on 4 tires. The cattle can go where the tractor can't. Let the cattle do the work. Let the cattle do the work became the phrase that Karen used in every subsequent extension publication. The phrase captured the core insight of stockpiled grazing, The reversal of the hay feeding model from bring the feed to the cattle to bring the cattle to the feed. The feed is standing in the ground. The cattle have 4 legs. The cattle are the delivery system. The tractor is not needed. The wagon is not needed. The bale ring is not needed. The mud is not created because the equipment that creates the mud never enters the field. Now let me tell you about Ray Pemberton, because the man whose tractor was buried to the frame on January 14th became Macon County's most aggressive convert to stockpiled grazing. Now, and the conversion happened in his south pasture in August of 2019, 7 months after the mud winter. Ray pulled his cattle off 80 acres of fescue on August 15th. He applied 46 pounds of nitrogen per acre, urea, broadcast with a pull-type spreader, the cheapest nitrogen application available. He watched the fescue grow through September and October, the tillers thickening, the leaves elongating, the forage accumulating in the warm fall weather that is fescue's preferred growing season. By November 1st, the fescue was 12 inches tall. Ray's 110 head began strip grazing on November 5th. The cattle ate for 65 days, through January 8th, when the stockpiled forage was consumed, and Ray switched to hay, feeding on a gravel pad he'd built over the summer. The pad was smaller than Dwayne's, 60 by 100 feet, and $4,200 in materials, but adequate for the shortened hay season. Ray fed hay for 70 days instead of his historical 150. His hay usage dropped from 280 bales to 130. His fuel consumption dropped by approximately 300 gallons. The 300 gallons he'd been burning every winter, fighting mud that no longer existed because the tractor no longer entered the pasture. Ray's cost savings in the first year, approximately $6,800 in reduced hay, $1,200 in reduced fuel, $1,500 in eliminated sacrifice area renovation, and an unquantified reduction in equipment wear and veterinary costs. Total first-year savings, approximately $9,500. The gravel pad cost $4,200. The pad paid for itself in the first winter. The nitrogen cost $18 per acre on 80 acres, $1,440. The net savings, approximately $3,860 in the first year, now rising to $8,060 per year in subsequent years when the pad cost was amortized. Ray's pastures emerged from the winter of 2019 to 2020 without damage. The strip-grazed areas recovered fully by May. The feeding pad was firm, functional, and required no renovation. The contrast with the previous winter, the buried tractor, the torn pastures, the 200-foot ruts, was complete. I spent 30 years fighting mud, Ray told Dwayne at the feed store. 30 years of getting stuck, tearing up pastures, burning fuel, and watching my cattle stand in cold mud up to their bellies. I thought it was just winter. I thought it was just Missouri. It's not winter, and it's not Missouri. It's the system. The system puts a tractor in a wet field every day for 5 months. The system creates the mud. Hey, change the system and the mud doesn't get created. Let me tell you about how this ends. Dwayne Heckman is 73 years old. His son-in-law, Travis, manages the cattle operation. Travis strip grazes stockpiled fescue from November through January and feeds hay on the gravel pad from January through March. The system is unchanged from 1985, when Dwayne first tried stockpiling after reading a University of Missouri circular on winter grazing management. The circular had been published in 1978. Dwayne read it in 1984. He implemented it in 1985. He was the only farmer in Macon County to implement it for 34 years, from 1985 to 2019, when the mud winter finally made 63 farmers drive to his pasture and listen to the system that the co-op had called lazy for 3 decades. The co-op doesn't call it lazy anymore. My 18 farms in Macon County now stockpile fescue for winter grazing. Not all of them strip graze. Some use front fence-only allocation, which is simpler but less efficient. Not all of them build gravel pads. Some still feed on the ground during the shortened hay season, accepting some mud damage in exchange for avoiding the pad construction cost. But all of them have reduced their hay feeding season from 150 days to 70 to 90 days. All of them have reduced their hay costs by 40 to 60%. All of them have reduced their mud damage by 50 to 80%. And all of them, when they stand in their pastures in December and watch their cattle graze, standing fescue on ground that's firm enough to walk on. Remember the winter of 2019 when every tractor in the county was stuck, and the only cattle that were eating were the cattle that walked to their own feed. The Farmall 706 that Dwayne used for hay work is in the machine shed. Travis uses a newer tractor, but the 706 is maintained. The tractor that didn't get stuck because the tractor didn't enter the pasture. The electric fence reels hang on the barn wall. The simple technology, the temporary wire and step-in posts, the equipment that replaced the tractor and wagon and bale ring as the winter feeding infrastructure. The fence weighs 30 pounds. The bale wagon weighs 6,000. The fence doesn't get stuck in the mud. The fence doesn't create mud. The fence just moves forward 200 feet every 3 days, and the cattle follow it, and the grass disappears, and the ground stays firm, and the whole system costs less than the diesel the neighbors burn, fighting the mud that their system creates. The mud didn't beat Dwayne in 2019 because Dwayne stopped fighting the mud in 1985. That's the whole story. Subscribe to The Average Farmer for more. We'll see you in the next one.